Listen, I'm going to tell you something about 5 signs your wife is entering a crisis phase and how to protect yourself that almost nobody has the guts to say out loud. And it's this: crisis doesn't erupt, it seeps. Slowly, quietly, invisibly. By the time you notice the smoke, the fire has already been burning for months, in places you never thought to check. People talk about midlife crisis like it's a cartoon: convertible cars, new hobbies, dramatic transformations, but the real thing, the lived thing, feels more like a shifting gravitational field. You wake up one day and the laws that governed your marriage, the unspoken rhythms, the warm familiarity, the predictable emotional weather, feel subtly off, like the planets have realigned when you weren't looking. And it's confusing because she hasn't become someone else. She's become someone she doesn't fully recognize, and the ripple hits you before she even realizes she's in trouble. That's the first truth most men miss. A crisis phase isn't about you. It's about pressure inside her that starts leaking into the space between you. You see a change. She feels a fracture. You're observing the surface. She's wrestling the undercurrent. And it's tempting to simplify it, to turn it into blame or fault or wrongdoing, but I've lived long enough and I've watched enough relationships collapse under the weight of quiet confusion to know that a crisis phase looks less like betrayal and more like a silent collision between who she's been and who she's becoming. Let me pull you into a memory. Years ago, I sat in a kitchen with a friend who looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. His wife had started acting different, not hostile, not distant enough to cause a fight, just off. Like her attention was turned inward, like she'd walked into a room inside her mind and locked the door behind her. He kept telling himself she's stressed, she's tired, but deep down he knew something had shifted. One night he finally asked her if everything was all right. She said yes. Too quickly, too brightly, too falsely. And that's how it usually starts. The smile that doesn't match the eyes. I remember telling him, "You're not imagining it. But don't jump to explanations. You haven't seen the whole story yet." That's the fundamental misunderstanding. Men assume a crisis phase is something done to them. But a crisis phase is something happening within her, and you're experiencing the tremors from the outside. There are 5 signs, 5 shifts that often show up when a woman is entering this internal storm. They're not scientific markers or diagnostic tools. They're patterns of human tension, the kind that emerge when someone is wrestling with a version of themselves they haven't lived before. I'm not going to list them like a cheap checklist. That's not how real life works. Real life is fluid, messy, non-linear. Instead, I'm going to talk to you the way I wish someone had talked to me years ago, directly, without the sugarcoating, without the panic, without the simplistic narratives. Because the signs themselves aren't the danger. The danger is misinterpreting them. A crisis phase can look like distance, but it isn't always about love fading. It can look like irritability, but it isn't always about resentment. It can look like withdrawal, but it isn't always about rejection. Sometimes it's simply a human being who suddenly realizes they've lived enough years to see the patterns of their life, and they're not sure they like the blueprint anymore. Let me give you another scene, one that stays with me. I once talked with a woman who described hitting her crisis phase at 39. She said it started quietly. She would sit in the car after work and feel an inexplicable sadness, like her life didn't quite fit her anymore. Nothing was wrong, she kept insisting. She loved her husband, loved her family, loved her routines. But inside, she felt like someone had loosened the screws that held her inner machinery together. She didn't want to burden him, didn't want to be dramatic, didn't want to make it a thing, so she said nothing. But silence has a way of reshaping the emotional atmosphere. Eventually, she told me, it wasn't that I didn't love him anymore. It was that I wasn't sure who I was, and I didn't want him to have to meet that uncertainty before I had the courage to face it myself. That's what men rarely hear. A crisis phase isn't the death of connection. It's a clash between identity and expectation. Her identity, her expectations, her sense of place in her own story. In the beginning, the signs are subtle. A shift in tone, a shorter fuse, an unexplained quiet, a sudden need for space, a distracted look that wasn't there before. But behind those small shifts is a larger truth. She's beginning to question the narrative of her own life. And here's where the misunderstanding becomes dangerous. Most men interpret these signs as signals of fault. I must be doing something wrong. She must be upset with me. She must not want me anymore. But that's the surface interpretation. The deeper truth is stranger, more complex, more human. She's reevaluating herself, and you're standing close enough to feel the tremble. If you don't understand that if you personalize what isn't personal, you end up reacting from fear instead of clarity. Fear makes you cling, fear makes you chase, fear makes you demand answers before she has them. Fear makes you escalate what needed patience. There's a different way to walk through this, a way that doesn't sacrifice your dignity, your boundaries, or your emotional stability, a way that lets you protect yourself without treating her like an adversary. Because protecting yourself isn't about building armor, it's about building awareness. Crisis isn't chaos. Crisis is a call for recalibration, and the only way forward is to understand the deeper layers beneath these signs, how they form, why they converge, and what they reveal about the human psyche when the pressure becomes too great to contain. Part 1 was the surface. Now we go deeper. Let's widen the lens. A crisis phase doesn't emerge from a vacuum. It is shaped by 1,000 micro-forces: cultural, psychological, hormonal, economic, technological. It's not an emotional tornado. It's a pressure system shaped by the world she's moving through. Think of it like a casino. Not the glamorous kind with neon lights and velvet ropes, but the deeper metaphor, a high-stimulus environment designed to overload human instincts. That's modern life. Constant comparison, endless measurement, silent competition, subtle judgment. Everyone is spinning some kind of wheel. And women especially are bombarded with conflicting narratives. Be independent. Be supportive. Be ambitious. Be nurturing. Be strong. Be soft. Be everything. We rarely talk about the psychological cost of that double bind, but it shows up years later, like delayed shock in the form of crisis. So when your wife begins showing the signs, those subtle shifts in energy, mood, or presence, you're not witnessing a sudden personal change. You're watching the point where cultural pressure meets internal exhaustion. Let me break down the second layer of truth. A crisis phase is often triggered by conflicting timelines. There's the timeline of who she used to be, there's the timeline of who she feels she should be, and there's the timeline of who she fears she may never become. These timelines collide like tectonic plates grinding under the surface until you start to feel the tremors in the relationship. This is the paradox. The moment she begins to question everything, you experience it as instability. Here's a scene to illustrate the mechanics. A man told me once about a moment he'll never forget. His wife, usually calm, usually collected, snapped one evening because the groceries weren't put away properly. He thought it was about the groceries. It wasn't. It was about the feeling that her whole life was a stack of responsibilities balanced on top of expectations she never fully agreed to. When the mind is overloaded, the smallest disruption becomes a doorway for suppressed fear. That night, after the argument, she sat on the couch and said quietly, "I don't know who I'm supposed to be anymore." That's a crisis phase in a single sentence. Another story. A woman in her 40s said she felt like she was living inside a double exposure, two lives layered on top of each other. One life was the life she built. The other was the life she wondered about, but never explored. She wasn't unhappy. She wasn't unloving. She was unanchored. Humans weren't built to hold multiple identities simultaneously. Yet modern life demands it, so something eventually cracks. Now, here's where the storm metaphor becomes useful. A crisis phase is not a hurricane that tears everything apart. It's a pressure system that rearranges the emotional atmosphere. Barometric pressure drops before a storm. People sense it before clouds form. Animals move before lightning strikes. You feel her crisis before she does. That's the strange truth. What looks like detachment is often her slowing down to examine the fault lines inside herself. What looks like irritability is often her trying to manage internal contradictions. What looks like distance is often her silently recalculating her story. If you react impulsively, if you interpret every sign as a threat, you end up amplifying the pressure. But if you observe it like an analyst, you begin to see the patterns. The first pattern, identity conflict. The second pattern, emotional compression. The third pattern, narrative collapse. Narrative collapse is when the story she's been living no longer feels like the story she wants to continue. That's the core of the crisis phase. Not dissatisfaction with you, but dissonance within herself. And once that narrative begins to collapse, the relationship feels the aftershocks. Here's the paradox nobody warns men about. If you try to fix her crisis, she'll feel controlled. If you ignore it, she'll feel unseen. If you panic, you'll destabilize both of you. If you get defensive, you'll make her feel trapped. So what's left? What protects you? Awareness, boundaries, emotional grounding, self-respect. calm observational clarity. Not heroics, not self-blame, not armchair psychology. You protect yourself by understanding the system, not by trying to control the storm. Because here's the deeper mechanism at play. A crisis phase is a recalibration of identity triggered by internal contradictions and external pressures. Your role isn't to diagnose, rescue, or solve. Your role is to stay steady in your own center while her emotional climate shifts. If you lose yourself, you lose the one thing that anchors the relationship. That's the second layer of truth. And now we descend to the deepest one, the part most people are too afraid to face because it strips away the illusions and reveals the roots of human transformation. Now we reach the deepest layer, the part no one warns you about because it's not simple, not flattering, and not comfortable. A crisis phase is not about marriage, not about gender, not about blame, not about right or wrong. It is about the terrifying moment a human being realizes they have more past than future, and that their past was shaped by choices they didn't fully understand at the time. That realization hits people at different moments after a loss, during a milestone birthday, in a quiet moment of reflection, or all at once without warning. But when it hits, it rearranges the internal architecture. She begins asking deeper questions. What does my life mean? What have I sacrificed? What have I become? What do I still want? What have I been postponing? What if the story needs to change? These questions are frightening. They make the foundation shake. And when someone is afraid, they don't always communicate clearly. They withdraw or become reactive or hyper-focused on details that don't matter, because the big questions feel too heavy to touch directly. The crisis phase isn't about you, but it will affect you. The key is to understand that you cannot and should not take responsibility for another person's existential reckoning. Here's the ultimate truth, the one at the bottom of all the noise, the metaphors, the pressure systems, the psychology. Every human goes through a moment when the story of their life no longer feels like their own. Some people run from it. Some people burn their life down. Some people freeze. Some people quietly rebuild from within. A woman entering a crisis phase is entering a moment of profound internal questioning. The signs you see are the shadows cast by those questions. So when we talk about protecting yourself, it's not about guarding against her. It's about guarding against fear, distortion, and self-erasure. You protect yourself by staying grounded in your own identity while she re-examines hers. You protect yourself by maintaining your boundaries, by not over-functioning, not collapsing into people-pleasing, not interpreting every shift as your fault. You protect yourself by listening without absorbing, supporting without surrendering, observing without personalizing. Because if you lose yourself in her crisis, you add one more collapse to the pile, and neither of you can afford that. Here's something I once heard from a woman long after she'd come out of her crisis phase. She said, "What saved us was that he didn't make my confusion his identity. He didn't cling. He didn't chase. He didn't collapse. He stayed steady. And in that steadiness, I remembered who I was." That's the quiet truth beneath all of this. People find their way back to themselves when the people around them stop trying to rearrange the storm. The deepest layer, this final layer, is not about predicting behavior or controlling outcomes. It's about understanding the human truth behind the signs. Her crisis is her crossroads. Your role is not to drag her down one path or force her toward another. Your role is to stand tall enough within yourself that you aren't swept away by someone else's internal tidal shift. The most resilient relationships aren't the ones that avoid crisis. They're the ones where each person keeps their own shape through it. If you can do that, if you can hold your boundaries, hold your center, hold your clarity, you protect not just yourself, but the possibility of connection on the other side of the storm. Because crisis doesn't mean the end. Crisis means something is trying to evolve, and evolution by its very nature feels like upheaval before it feels like truth.